Under the brilliant white lights of the Anderson Motors showroom, where employees were still photographing the latest SUV model for CEO Callista Anderson, a group of masked men stormed through the entrance, shattering the glass doors. They rushed toward her with knives drawn, one pressing a blade against her side, screaming for the keys. Everyone scattered in panic, but from the service bay in the back, a man charged forward, delivering precise military-grade strikes that dropped the attackers one by one. When Callista looked up, trembling, to thank her rescuer, she froze in shock. It was George Dermot, the single father she had fired just that morning. The morning had started like any other for George Dermot. At 36 years old, he moved through his modest apartment with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned to do everything alone. His daughter, Matilda, 7 years old with her mother's dark curls and his own gray eyes, sat at their small kitchen table eating cereal while he packed her lunch. The sunlight streaming through their window was weak, filtered through the buildings of their working-class neighborhood. But it was enough. It had to be. George's wife had died 3 years ago from a heart condition nobody knew she had. One morning she had been making breakfast, laughing at something Matilda said, and by that afternoon she was gone. The grief had nearly broken him. But Matilda needed him, and that simple fact had pulled him back from the edge every single day since. He had been special operations once, part of a classified unit called Epsilon 9 that handled threats most people would never know existed. He had been good at it, excellent even. But when Matilda was born, something shifted inside him. The missions that once felt like purpose began to feel like borrowed time, hours stolen from his daughter's childhood. When his wife died, the choice became clear. He resigned, gave up the adrenaline and the brotherhood, and the sense that he mattered, and became just another single dad trying to make rent. Now he worked at Anderson Motors, a luxury car dealership owned by one of the wealthiest families in the city. He delivered vehicles to clients and helped out in the service bay when they needed extra hands. It was not glamorous work. The other employees looked through him like he was part of the furniture, but it paid enough to keep Matilda fed and clothed, and that was all that mattered. That morning, Matilda had spiked a fever. By the time George got her to the urgent care clinic, got her checked out, got her fever reducers, and dropped her at his neighbor's apartment, he was 20 minutes late to work. He had called ahead, explained the situation, but when he arrived at the dealership, the floor manager was waiting with a thin smile and a pink slip. Callista Anderson had been in the office that morning. She was 33, blonde hair falling in careful waves past her shoulders, dressed in a gray suit that probably cost more than George's monthly salary. She had taken over Anderson Motors when she was only 28, after her father's sudden retirement, and had turned it into an empire. She was brilliant and driven, and absolutely ruthless when it came to standards. The floor manager had brought George up to her office. She barely looked at him as she signed the termination papers. "We have standards here, Mr. Dermot," she said, her voice cool and professional. "Punctuality is one of them. If you cannot manage your personal life without affecting your work, then this is not the right place for you." George had wanted to explain. Wanted to tell her about Matilda's fever, about the long wait at the clinic, about being a single parent with nobody to call for help, but he could see in her eyes that it would not matter. To Callista Anderson, he was just another employee who had failed to meet expectations. Replaceable, forgettable. He had left her office with his dignity intact but his pride bruised, collected his things from his locker, and started to head out. But he had forgotten to return the keys to the last vehicle he had delivered. So he went back to the service bay one more time, moving through the familiar space that would no longer be his workplace after today. That was when he heard the glass shatter. The showroom floor had been busy that afternoon. Salespeople were showing vehicles to well-dressed clients. Photographers were setting up shots of the new luxury SUV that would be the centerpiece of their next advertising campaign. Callista herself had come down from her office to oversee the shoot, wanting everything perfect. Then the doors exploded inward. 4 men in dark clothes and ski masks rushed in with weapons drawn. One had a sawed-off shotgun. The others carried knives and crowbars. They moved with purpose, not the frantic energy of desperate amateurs but the cold efficiency of professionals. "Everyone on the ground," the one with the shotgun shouted. "Nobody moves. Nobody gets hurt." People screamed and dropped. Salespeople dove behind desks. Clients pressed themselves against the walls. The photographers abandoned their expensive equipment and ran for the back exits. But Callista stood frozen beside the SUV. Laptop bag clutched in her hands. The bag contained more than just her computer. Inside was a prototype drive with the latest iteration of their self-driving AI technology, something her company had invested millions in developing. She had brought it to show the board that afternoon. One of the masked men saw her and moved fast. He grabbed her arm, twisted it behind her back, and pressed a knife against her ribs. "The bag," he hissed. "Give me the bag, or I open you up right here." Callista's mind raced. This was not random. They knew what she was carrying. They had planned this. The man pressed the knife harder, and she felt the sharp point through her blouse. Her fingers started to loosen on the bag's handle. That was when George came through the service bay door. He took in the scene in less than a second. The armed men, the terrified civilians. The woman being held at knife point. His body moved before his mind finished processing, old training taking over like muscle memory that had never truly faded. He charged the nearest attacker, a man standing guard by the entrance. The strike was textbook military close-quarters combat. A palm heel to the jaw, followed by a knee to the solar plexus. The man went down hard. His knife, skittering, across the polished floor. The man holding Callista turned at the sound, startled, and that moment of distraction was all George needed. He closed the distance in 3 long strides, grabbed the man's knife hand, and twisted with precise force. There was a sickening crack as the wrist broke, and the man screamed, releasing Callista and stumbling backward. The man with the shotgun swung it toward George, but George was already moving. He ducked low, came up inside the gun's effective range, and drove his shoulder into the man's chest. They crashed into a display of luxury sedan models, setting off car alarms that filled the showroom with piercing sound. The 4th attacker rushed George from the side, crowbar raised high. George rolled, felt the crowbar whistle past his head, and swept the man's legs. As the attacker fell, George delivered a precise strike to the temple that left him unconscious before he hit the ground. The whole fight lasted less than 30 seconds. George stood in the center of the showroom, breathing hard, surrounded by groaning attackers and shattered glass. His hands were bleeding from where he had caught the shotgun barrel. His shirt was torn, but he was alive, and so was everyone else. Callista stared at him, her laptop bag still clutched to her chest, her mind unable to process what she had just witnessed. The man she had fired that morning for being 20 minutes late had just taken down 4 armed criminals with the kind of precision that spoke of serious military training. This was not just some delivery driver who happened to be good in a fight. This was someone with a very specific and very dangerous skill set. "Are you hurt?" George asked, his voice surprisingly gentle given what had just happened. Callista shook her head, unable to find words. Security arrived moments later, followed quickly by police. The attackers were arrested, dragged away, still groaning from their injuries. Officers took statements from witnesses. Paramedics checked everyone for injuries. Through it all, Callista kept watching George. He answered the police's questions with calm efficiency, downplayed his own role, made sure everyone else was safe before accepting treatment for his own cuts. He was respectful, almost deferential, but there was something in the way he moved, the way he scanned the room constantly, that spoke of someone who had lived in dangerous places and never quite left them behind. When the police captain asked about his background, George kept it vague. "Former military," he said. some training in personal security. Nothing special, but Callista knew it was more than that. She had seen the way he fought. Those were not moves learned in basic training. Those were techniques that took years of specialized instruction and real combat experience to master. She requested the security footage from the dealership's cameras. Every angle, every second. She wanted to understand who George Dermot really was. That night, alone in her office after everyone else had gone home, Callista watched the footage again and again. She saw the way George assessed the threat in a fraction of a second, the way he prioritized targets based on danger level, the way he controlled each opponent with minimal force necessary to neutralize them. This was not a man who had gotten lucky. This was a man who had been trained to do exactly this. She thought about that morning, about firing him for being 20 minutes late, about not letting him explain, about treating him like he was beneath her consideration. Shame burned in her chest. But something else burned there too. Fear. If George Dermot was this dangerous, this skilled, what was he doing working as a delivery driver at her dealership? And, more troubling, why had those men attacked her showroom on the exact day that George happened to be there? The questions multiplied in her mind like dark flowers. The next morning, a letter arrived at Anderson Motors headquarters. It was simple, printed on plain white paper, with no return address. Give back the data. You know what you're holding. Callista took it to her head of security, a former police detective named Marcus Webb. He examined it carefully, his expression growing more serious by the second. "This is not amateurs," Marcus said. "The timing, the knowledge of your schedule, the specific target of your laptop, someone has been planning this. They wanted the AI prototype." Callista said quietly, "Looks that way, which means they'll try again." Callista felt cold despite the warm office. She had thought the attack was over, that the danger had passed with the arrests. But this letter suggested something bigger, something organized. Marcus increased security. More cameras, more guards, stricter access protocols. But Callista could not shake the feeling that whoever was behind this was always one step ahead. 2 days later, her office computer was hacked. She came in one morning to find her screens displaying a message. Next time, it won't just be the showroom. Her hands shook as she called Marcus. He brought in a cybersecurity team, but the hackers had covered their tracks perfectly. No trace, no fingerprints in the digital architecture. That afternoon, Callista held an emergency meeting with her executive team. They debated bringing in the FBI, going public with the threats, shutting down the AI project entirely. But before they could decide anything, Marcus came to her with new information. "We identified the group behind the attack," he said, sliding a folder across her desk. "They're connected to a man named Silas Merrick." Callista opened the folder and felt her blood run cold. Silas Merrick was a name whispered in certain circles. A technology crime lord who specialized in stealing corporate secrets and selling them to the highest bidder. He had connections to organized crime, corrupt officials, and mercenary groups. The kind of man who could orchestrate exactly this kind of coordinated assault. "How do we stop him?" Callista asked. Marcus hesitated. "We might not be able to. Men like Merrick, they don't stop until they get what they want, or until someone stops them permanently." That night, Callista could not sleep. She kept thinking about the attack, about the hackers, about Silas Merrick's reach, and she kept thinking about George Dermot. The man who had saved her was the same man she had dismissed without a second thought. The same man whose skill set suggested he had faced men like Silas Merrick before. The same man who had been right there, right when she needed him most. Was that coincidence? Or was George somehow involved in all of this? The suspicion felt like poison in her mind, but she could not ignore it. So she did something she was not proud of. She called Marcus and asked him to bring George in for questioning. George sat in the security office, a small windowless room with gray walls and fluorescent lights. Marcus Webb stood across from him, arms crossed, expression hard. Through the one-way glass, Callista watched, her heart hammering in her chest. "Tell me about your military background," Marcus said. George kept his voice level. "I served. Got out when my wife died. Needed to raise my daughter." "What unit?" "That's classified. Men with classified backgrounds don't usually end up delivering cars. Men with daughters do what they need to do." Marcus leaned forward. "Those men who attacked the showroom, they were professionals. Trained. And you took them down like it was nothing. That's not normal." "I did what anyone would do." "No. You did what someone with very specific combat training would do. Training that takes years. Training that costs governments millions of dollars." "So I'll ask again, George. What unit were you in? And what were you doing at that showroom on that exact day?" George's jaw tightened. He wanted to defend himself, to explain, but he knew how it looked. The timing was too perfect, his skills too obvious. To someone looking for a conspiracy, he was the perfect suspect. "I was there because I worked there," he said quietly. "Worked there. Until your boss fired me." Behind the glass, Callista flinched at those words. "And the combat skills? I was special operations. Counter-terrorism. I did my job and I got out. That's all. Is it? Or did you know those men? Maybe you used to work with them. Maybe this whole thing was staged." George's eyes flashed with anger for the first time. "I saved her life. Those men would have killed her if I hadn't been there. Or maybe you arranged it so you could play hero. Get close to her. Get access to her company. You're wrong. Then prove it." But George had no proof. He had no way to demonstrate that he was just a single father who had been in the wrong place at the right time, or the right place at the right time, depending on how you looked at it. The door opened, and a small figure rushed in. Matilda Dermot, her dark curls bouncing, her face streaked with tears, ran straight to George and wrapped her arms around his legs. "Daddy," she sobbed. "Mrs. Chen said men took you away. I was so scared." George lifted his daughter, held her close, stroked her hair. "It's okay, sweetheart. I'm okay. Everything's okay." Behind the glass, Callista watched father and daughter together. She saw the way George's entire body softened when he held Matilda. The way he whispered gentle reassurances. The way Matilda buried her face in his neck with complete trust. This was not a man playing a role. This was not someone with ulterior motives. This was a father who loved his daughter more than anything in the world. Callista's suspicions crumbled like sand. She left the observation room and entered the security office. Marcus looked at her in surprise, but she ignored him. She walked straight to George. "I'm sorry," she said. "This was wrong. You saved my life, and I repaid you with suspicion. I'm sorry." George met her eyes, and she saw the hurt there, but also understanding. "You were scared. I get it. Will you let me make it right?" Before George could answer, all the lights in the building went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in red. Alarms began to wail. On the security monitors, Marcus saw armed figures moving through the building's lower levels. "We're under attack," he said, reaching for his radio. "All units. We have a breach on floors 1 and 2. Armed intruders. I repeat, armed intruders." George set Matilda down gently. "Stay close to me," he told her, then turned to Callista. "Do you have a safe room?" "Executive floor, but we need to get to the elevator. Elevators will be compromised." "We go through the service corridors." Marcus nodded. "I'll stay here, coordinate the response." "Get them out, George." George took Matilda's hand and motioned for Callista to follow. They moved quickly through the hallways. George, leading with the confidence of someone who had navigated hostile environments before. He checked corners, listened at doors, kept them moving in a pattern that made tactical sense. They were almost to the service corridor when a figure stepped out in front of them. The man was tall, broad, dressed in tactical gear. He raised a submachine gun, and Callista's heart stopped. But George was faster. He pulled Matilda behind him, shoved Callista back, and charged the gunman. The fight was brief and brutal. George disarmed the man with a move that involved broken fingers and a dislocated shoulder, then knocked him unconscious with a precise strike. "Keep moving," George said, breathing hard. They reached the service corridor, a narrow passage lined with pipes and electrical conduits. George led them down 3 floors, then through a maintenance tunnel that connected to the underground parking garage. The whole time, Matilda held his hand tight, her eyes wide but trusting. In the garage, Callista heard footsteps behind them. Multiple sets, moving fast. George heard them too. He looked around quickly, spotted a maintenance bay with vehicles in various states of repair. "There," he said, pulling them toward a partially assembled luxury sedan. "Get in the back and stay down." They squeezed into the vehicle just as armed men entered the garage. Through the gaps in the car's frame, Callista could see them, 6 figures in tactical gear, moving in formation, checking vehicles methodically. George put his finger to his lips, a clear signal for silence. Matilda buried her face in Callista's jacket, her small body trembling. Callista held the girl close, feeling her heart pound against her ribs. The men came closer. Callista could hear their radio chatter, calm and professional. These were not street thugs. These were soldiers or mercenaries, people who killed for a living. One of them stopped right next to their vehicle. Callista held her breath, certain they would be discovered. Then an explosion rocked the garage. Smoke and fire erupted from the far side, and the armed men immediately shifted focus, moving toward the blast. George waited until they were far enough away, then whispered, "Now, move fast and quiet." They slipped out of the vehicle and headed for an emergency exit. George pulled the door open carefully, checked the stairwell, then led them up, not to the executive floors where Callista had suggested, but down, toward the sub-basement levels where the company's prototype testing facilities were located. "Why are we going down?" Callista asked. "They'll expect us to go up. And down here, there's a service tunnel that leads to the next building. Used to be an old subway line before they converted it." "How do you know that?" George gave her a look. "I delivered cars here for 6 months. I learned the building." They reached the sub-basement and found the tunnel entrance. It was a narrow passage with dim lighting, smelling of concrete and old water. George went first, then Matilda, then Callista. Behind them, they could hear shouts and gunfire echoing through the stairwell. Halfway through the tunnel, they met 2 more armed men. This time, there was no avoiding a fight. George put himself between the attackers and his daughter, told Callista to run with Matilda, and engaged both men simultaneously. Callista grabbed Matilda's hand and ran, but she looked back, just in time, to see George take a brutal hit to his side. He absorbed it, didn't go down, kept fighting, but she saw blood spreading across his shirt. "George!" she screamed. "Run!" he shouted back, blocking a knife strike and delivering a savage elbow to his opponent's throat. Callista ran with Matilda through the tunnel, her mind racing. George was injured, fighting 2 trained killers to buy them time. She could not just leave him. She spotted a fire axe mounted on the tunnel wall. She grabbed it, told Matilda to hide behind a support column, and ran back. George had gotten one man down, but the other had him in a chokehold from behind, knife raised to stab. Callista swung the axe, not at the man but at the water pipe above his head. It burst with tremendous pressure, knocking the attacker off balance. George broke free, spun, and finished the fight. He looked at Callista, surprised. "I told you to run, and I told myself I was done abandoning you." They made it to the end of the tunnel, and emerged in the basement of the adjacent building. George was bleeding from the wound in his side, his face pale. Callista used her jacket to apply pressure while they caught their breath. Matilda clung to her father, tears streaming down her face. "Daddy, you're hurt." "I'm okay, sweetheart. Just a scratch." But it was more than a scratch, and they all knew it. "We need to call the police," Callista said. "The FBI. Someone." George shook his head. "These men, the way they move, the equipment they have. This is Silas Merrick's work." Callista stared at him. "How do you know that name?" George was quiet for a long moment, his hand pressed to his bleeding side. Then he sighed. The sound of a man who had carried secrets too long. "Because I've met him before," George said. 5 years ago, my unit was tasked with taking down a trafficking network. Silas Merrick was running it. We got close, almost had him. I was ordered to eliminate him on sight. What happened? Matilda was born that week. I was on leave, at the hospital. By the time I got back to duty, Merrick had disappeared. My commander wanted me to track him, said it was my responsibility to finish the mission. But I looked at my daughter, at my wife, and I realized I didn't want to be the kind of father who wasn't there. So I resigned. Gave up the hunt. Gave up everything. And now he's back. He must have recognized me from the showroom cameras, saw me take down his men, and realized the same man who almost caught him 5 years ago just happened to be working at your company. He probably thinks I've been protecting you all along, that I'm some kind of corporate security. He doesn't know I'm just a delivery driver who got lucky." Callista felt the weight of it all crash down on her. The attack, the threats, the danger, all because George had tried to do the right thing in that showroom. "This is my fault," she said. "I brought you into this." "No." George's voice was firm despite his pain. "Merrick brought himself into this, and now we need to finish what I should have finished 5 years ago. You're hurt. We need to get you to a hospital. We need to stop Merrick, before he hurts anyone else, before he gets his hands on your AI technology and sells it to people who will use it to kill." Callista looked at this man, this single father who had given up a warrior's life to be present for his daughter, who was now bleeding because he had protected them. She made a decision. "Then we stop him together." Over the next 2 days, George and Callista planned. They used her resources and his knowledge of how Merrick operated to construct a trap. They would leak false information that Callista was transferring the AI prototype to a secure facility outside the city. They would make it look real enough that Merrick would commit his forces. Marcus coordinated with the FBI to position agents around the location. The trap would be set at an abandoned warehouse complex on the waterfront, a place with limited exits and good sight lines for law enforcement. George insisted that Matilda stay with his neighbor, far from any possible danger. Matilda had clung to him when he dropped her off, made him promise to come back. "I always come back," he told her, kissing her forehead. "Always." The night of the operation, Callista and George drove to the warehouse in an armored vehicle, followed at a distance by FBI tactical teams. The prototype in Callista's possession was a fake, but it looked real enough to pass a quick inspection. They parked inside the warehouse and waited. The building was dark, except for their headlights. The air thick, with the smell of old oil and rust. "He'll come," George said quietly. "How do you know?" "Because men like Merrick always think they're the smartest person in the room. He'll think this is his chance." They did not have to wait long. Vehicles approached from multiple directions, surrounding the warehouse. Armed men in tactical gear poured out. At least 20 of them. They had night vision, body armor, automatic weapons. This was not a smash-and-grab operation. This was a military assault. And then, Silas Merrick himself walked in. He was a tall man in his 50s, silver-haired and well-dressed, looking more like a business executive than a crime lord. But his eyes were cold, calculating, the eyes of someone who had done terrible things without losing a moment of sleep. "Miss Anderson," he said pleasantly, "thank you for making this so easy. I was expecting more resistance." "You're not getting the prototype," Callista said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Oh, I think I am. You see, I have something you value, something that will make you very cooperative." He gestured, and two of his men dragged someone into the warehouse. Callista's heart stopped when she saw who it was. Matilda. The little girl was terrified, tears streaming down her face, but unharmed. One of Merrick's men held her gently but firmly, a warning clear in his grip. George moved before Callista could stop him, lunging toward his daughter. But four men grabbed him, forced him to his knees. A gun pressed against the back of his head. "George Dermot," Merrick said with genuine pleasure. "I recognized you from the showroom footage. Older, softer around the edges, but still the same man who cost me millions 5 years ago. I've wondered what happened to you. Turns out you became a delivery driver. How the mighty have fallen." "Let my daughter go," George said, his voice shaking with controlled rage. "This is between you and me. No. This is about the AI technology. Miss Anderson will give it to me, and then I'll decide whether your daughter lives or dies. Maybe I'll be merciful. Maybe not." Callista felt everything in her shift. This man had threatened her, attacked her company, put dozens of lives at risk. And now he was using a 7-year-old child as a bargaining chip. She had been raised to be careful, to calculate, to always think 3 moves ahead. But sometimes calculation was not enough. Sometimes you had to act on pure instinct. She threw the prototype case at Merrick's feet. "Fine, take it. Just let her go." Merrick smiled and bent to pick up the case. That was when Callista charged him. She was not trained in combat. She was not strong or fast or experienced. But she was angry and terrified and determined, and that gave her something Merrick did not expect. She crashed into him with all her weight, knocking him off balance. The warehouse erupted into chaos. FBI agents stormed in from multiple entry points. Gunfire cracked through the air. Merrick's men scattered, some fighting, some running. In the confusion, George broke free from his captors, fought his way to Matilda, and pulled her away from danger. But Merrick recovered quickly. He pulled a pistol and aimed it at Callista, fury in his eyes. "You stupid woman. You just killed yourself." The shot came, but not from Merrick's gun. George had thrown himself between the bullet and Callista, taking the round high in his shoulder. He went down hard, blood spreading across his shirt. Callista screamed his name. Merrick raised the gun again, but this time FBI tactical agents were on him. They took him down with professional efficiency, weapons trained, voices barking orders. Within seconds, Merrick was face down on the concrete, hands cuffed behind his back. The battle was over in less than 2 minutes. Merrick's men were either arrested or fleeing into the night where more agents waited. The warehouse filled with law enforcement, paramedics, and the harsh lights of emergency vehicles. Callista knelt beside George, her hands shaking as she tried to apply pressure to his wound. Matilda was crying, holding her father's hand. "You're going to be okay," Callista said, her voice breaking. "You're going to be fine." George looked up at her with a small smile. "Still firing me for being late?" Despite everything, she laughed through her tears. "You're such an idiot." "Yeah, but I'm your idiot now." Paramedics arrived and took over, loading George onto a stretcher. Callista rode with him in the ambulance, holding Matilda on her lap, the little girl finally starting to calm down now that the danger had passed. At the hospital, they rushed George into surgery. Callista waited with Matilda in a private room, both of them exhausted, traumatized, but alive. Matilda fell asleep, curled up on the couch, and Callista watched over her, this brave little girl who had been through so much. She thought about George, about the assumptions she had made, about the way she had dismissed him as just another replaceable employee. She thought about how wrong she had been about almost everything. Hours later, the doctor emerged with good news. George would make a full recovery. The bullet had missed anything vital, and the surgery had gone perfectly. He would need time to heal, but he would be fine. When they finally let her into his room, George was awake but groggy from the anesthesia. Matilda climbed onto the bed carefully, hugging her father with gentle fierceness. Callista stood at the foot of the bed, not quite sure what to say. "Thank you," she finally managed. "For everything." George shook his head slightly. "You're the one who charged Merrick. That was either the bravest or the most reckless thing I've ever seen. I learned from the best." Over the following weeks, George recovered, while Callista visited often, bringing food and flowers. They talked for hours about his time in special operations, her struggles running a company, and the unexpected ways life changes direction. The FBI investigation uncovered Merrick's network of corporate espionage spanning multiple countries. The evidence ensured he would spend the rest of his life in prison. When George was cleared to return to work, Callista offered him the position of chief of security for Anderson Motors. George hesitated. "I don't want charity." Callista smiled. "George, you stopped 4 armed men, survived 2 assault teams, planned a sting operation that caught one of the most dangerous criminals in the tech sector, and took a bullet for me. If anything, I'm getting a bargain." He accepted. 3 months later, the showroom that had been damaged in the original attack was completely renovated. It reopened with a ceremony featuring the new security measures George had implemented, making Anderson Motors one of the safest dealerships in the country. After the ceremony, as people mingled and champagne flowed, Callista found George standing by the same SUV that had been photographed the day of the attack. He was in a suit now, looking more comfortable than she would have expected in the formal clothes. Matilda ran over, her dress bouncing, carrying a bouquet of flowers almost as big as she was. "Daddy, these are for Miss Callista. I picked them out myself." George handed them to Callista with a shy smile. She insisted. Callista took the flowers, touched. "They're beautiful, Matilda." "Thank you." The little girl beamed, then looked between the 2 adults with a knowing expression far too wise for a 7-year-old. "Daddy, I think Miss Callista likes you." "Matilda," George said, embarrassed. But Callista laughed. She reached out and took George's hand, gently, tentatively. He looked surprised, but did not pull away. "That day," she said softly, "when you saved my life, I thought that was the end of something. But it was actually the beginning. You saved more than my life, George. You saved me from becoming someone I didn't want to be, someone who couldn't see people for who they really are." George squeezed her hand. "You gave me something too. A chance to be more than just a father surviving day to day. You gave me purpose again." "So where does that leave us?" He smiled. The first truly unguarded smile she had seen from him. "I guess we figure it out together." Matilda cheered and hugged both of them, pulling them into an impromptu group hug right there in the middle of the showroom. Other guests noticed and smiled, some applauding, touched by the obvious affection between the unlikely trio. Sunlight streamed through the new showroom windows, glass that was bulletproof now but no less transparent, casting everything in warm golden light. The space had been rebuilt stronger than before, just like the 3 people standing in its center. George Dermot had come to this showroom as a delivery driver who barely registered in anyone's awareness. He had been fired without being heard, dismissed as replaceable. And then, in one violent moment, he had revealed himself to be anything but ordinary. Callista Anderson had come to that same showroom as a CEO who thought she had everything figured out, who thought she could judge a person's worth by their position. And then one violent moment had shown her how wrong she was. They had both been broken by life and loss. But somehow, through danger and desperation, they had found each other. They had built something new from the wreckage. Now they stood together, with Matilda between them, three people who had chosen to be a family. Not because it was easy or expected, but because sometimes the best things in life come from the most unlikely places. A man who had given up everything to be a good father had found love again. A woman who had almost lost herself to ambition had found her heart. And a little girl who had known too much loss had found someone new to love her. Maybe that was what heroes really looked like. Not soldiers or CEOs or people with power. Just ordinary people doing extraordinary things when it mattered most. The showroom lights glowed against the gathering dusk. Through the windows, three figures stood close together, laughing, whole, perfect.